Welcome back everyone to another ACE lecture. Today's lecture is going to focus on the respiratory system. We are going to discuss general functions of the system including gas exchange, thermoregulation, as well as the pH control. We will also go over structure of the lungs and alveoli. We will discuss how the medulla controls respiratory rate in order to adjust the pH. We will also discuss different defense mechanisms that are available in the respiratory tract in order to prevent dust particles from reaching the alveoli. And then finally, we will go over the breathing mechanism in relation to the changes to the intrapleural pressure and discuss how during breathing and during exhalation, how this pressure changes and causes airflow from the atmospheric air into the alveoli. Alright, so with that general outline in mind, let's move on with discussing the general functions of the respiratory tract. So the respiratory tract starts with the nose and the mouth. Nose is made of cartilage and bones as well as nasal cavity, and its function is basically to filter the air with nasal hairs while humidify and warms the air that is being inhaled through the nose. We also have the olfactory epithelium that is located on the superior region of the nasal cavity, and this structure consists of the sensory receptors that help with smell perception. The next structure is pharynx, which connects nose and the mouth to the esophagus and the trachea. And we just discussed in the digestive tract video how in order to prevent the food particles from entering the trachea, which can cause choking, there would be closure of epiglottis channel anytime we are swallowing food, as a consequence of which now food particles will directly go through the esophagus, and from here on they would enter the stomach. But then while we are breathing, that's the time that epiglottis will be open in order to allow air to enter the trachea. So once again, pharynx, which is located in this area, is basically a tube-like structure that joins nose and the mouth to the larynx, trachea, and esophagus. So we've already discussed the function of the esophagus is to let food down into the digestive tract, particularly stomach is the next structure that it will reach. And then regarding trachea, it will divide into smaller branches called bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, until they will eventually become so small that are called respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts and sacs. And it's actually air exchange that happens in these two last structures. That's why I've shown these two structures in pink, because these are the respiratory zone where gas exchange can happen. The rest of the structures shown here are just for conducting air all the way down to the respiratory zone, but basically these are not involved in gas exchange. Okay, now there's one last structure that I would like to discuss with you, and that's larynx, which is located on top of the trachea. So here we have larynx, which is made of a pair of elastic bands of muscles. So it has pair of elastic band of muscles that are called vocal cords, and its job is to produce sounds. Alright, and so with the general outline of structures of the respiratory system, now we can go over different functions of the respiratory system. So as you're aware, number one function of the respiratory system is gas exchange, where CO2 will be exhaled while O2 will be inhaled in order to allow oxygenated blood to return back to the left side of the heart with the help of the pulmonary vein. So gas exchange. Lose CO2 and gain O2 in the lungs. The other function of the respiratory system is temperature regulation or thermal regulation. And this is due to the fact that the respiratory system is highly vascularized. And so therefore, once these capillaries are dilated, a lot of heat can be dissipated through the evaporative cooling. So there would be evaporative cooling through the dilated vessels of the respiratory tract. But I would like you to know that this type of thermoregulation is more commonly seen in birds. Humans, on the other hand, we mostly rely on our skin as well as muscles. So once we are feeling cold, our muscles will start to shiver, while the capillaries in the skin will constrict so that we don't lose any heat through our skin. On the other hand, when we are feeling hot, that's the time that our sweat gland will start to work so that it would cause evaporative cooling on the surface of the skin, and our capillaries of the skin will also dilate in order to dissipate heat through our skin. So again, thermoregulation regarding the respiratory tract is more seen in birds rather than in humans. And finally, the third function of the respiratory system is to regulate pH. And so in order to understand the role of the respiratory system in pH regulation, I just have to discuss some chemistry concepts here. So CO2 can be combined with water with the help of the carbonic anhydrase enzyme in order to yield carbonic acid. And now this carbonic acid can dissociate into bicarbonate ion as well as a hydrogen ion. And so because hydrogen ion is extremely acidic, if there is elevated concentration of CO2 in our blood, this equation will be shifted to the right side, as a consequence of which there would be elevated H+, and so therefore pH of our blood will decrease. Once this happens, there is a respiratory regulatory center in our brain, and that is located in medulla. So that's important. I would like you to remember that medulla is the center for regulating the respiratory rate. Once medulla senses decrease in pH, it would signal the respiratory system to increase the respiration rate as well as the respiration depth. So what happens once there is an increase in respiration rate? There would be a drop in CO2 concentration of the blood, as a consequence of which now the equation shifts to the left side. So once it shifts to the left side, the H+ concentration will drop, and so therefore pH will be increased until it's normalized. Okay, so another function of the respiratory system is regulating pH by adjusting the CO2 concentration of our blood. And what's the system that is responsible for regulating the breathing rate? It's the medulla that is located in our brain. And here I have summarized the findings, how CO2 can be combined with water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ion and HCO3. Under conditions where there is low pH, there is therefore high H+ concentration and high CO2. That shifts the equation to the left side. Once this happens, the body responds by increasing the respiration rate, as a consequence of which CO2 will drop, and the equation would be shifted to the left side, as a consequence of which H+ concentration will drop. The kidney will also help under these circumstances by increasing reabsorption of HCO3, which will also push the equation to the left side. Alternatively, let's say that we are having elevation in pH. Let's discuss how these two systems will cope with that. Okay. Alright, so now we are discussing that we have an elevation in pH. So what happens once there is increase in pH? It means that we have low concentration of H+, and so therefore we need to push the equation to the right side so that H+ concentration would increase. So how can we do that? One way to do that is by decreasing reabsorption of HCO3 and letting it get excreted in the urine. So therefore by losing HCO3 right here, the equation would be pushed to the right side. Alternatively, the respiratory rate could decrease, as a consequence of which, so there is decreased respiratory rate, as a consequence of which there would be elevated CO2 in our blood that will again push the equation to the right side. Consequently, there would be elevated H+ concentration, and so pH will drop until it normalizes. Okay, so my point here is that the lungs and the kidneys work in conjunctions in order to regulate the pH of our blood. The next topic is structure of the lungs and alveoli. So basically the epithelium lining of the respiratory tree is covered by two main structures. One is cilia and the other is a mucus that is secreted by goblet cells. So we have mucus that is being secreted by goblet cells. And the function of this mucus is to trap any dust, pollen, or other contaminants. So it will trap particles and prevent them from reaching the alveoli. On the other hand, the function of cilia is to move the mucus upward towards the pharynx, where we can either swallow it or cough it out. And so therefore these two components of the respiratory tract help prevent the particles from reaching the alveoli. However, sometimes it's inevitable and some of these small particles could reach the alveoli. And under those circumstances, the macrophages that are present in the alveoli will engulf them and get rid of those particles. So here I have shown you again the structure of the respiratory tree, but in addition I also provided details for you to show you how the respiratory tree is covered with cilia. And these cilia are shown here in blue color, which are small hair-like structures that can help move the mucus upward towards the pharynx. And then we discussed how it's the function of the goblet cells in order to produce mucus. Next, moving on to the mechanism of alveolar exchange. And here I would like to provide you a quick summary of what happens in our heart. I've already discussed that in our circulatory system, but here let's review that again. So we have the left side of the heart, which handles the oxygenated blood that is returning from the lungs. So we have the left atrium and then the left ventricle, which pumps blood all the way to the systemic circulation. And then the deoxygenated blood will return with superior and inferior vena cava to the right atrium. Right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle, and from here on pump deoxygenated blood into the lungs. That's where gas exchange happens, and then oxygenated blood will return to the left atrium again, and the cycle continues. So here is what we are talking about. The deoxygenated blood has reached the alveoli of the lungs. So under these circumstances, there is a high CO2 concentration of the blood and low oxygen. And so therefore CO2 will be diffused out into the alveoli and get exhaled, while O2 will be picked up by the blood. And so consequently, blood that returns from the lungs has high oxygen content. Now, one point that I would like to mention here is that we are dealing with the capillaries here. And capillaries are only made of a thin layer of endothelial cells. So here there is only one layer of cells that CO2 and O2 has to pass through. Likewise, with alveoli, there is only one layer of squamous cells. So here we are only having one layer of squamous cells. And I've shown you right here how alveolar ducts and sacs are made of only one layer of squamous cells. And so my point here is that there is not that much barrier for gas exchange. There is only one layer of cell from the capillaries and another layer of cell from the alveolus. So total of 2 layers of cells that these gases have to pass through. And then the distance between alveoli and the capillaries is about 1 micron, which is pretty short. Next, I would like to discuss Henry's law with you. So even though this is a chemistry law, MCAT stresses to discuss this topic in relation to its role in the respiratory tract. So according to the Henry law, the solubility of a particular gas in a given volume of a particular solvent at a given temperature is directly proportional to equilibrium partial pressure of the gas above solvent. So let's say here we have a container that has water in there, and have another exact container with the same volume of water and the same temperature. Next, we will fill the chambers with 100% O2, but one of the chambers will have a much higher pressure than the other one. And so according to the Henry's law, the amount of oxygen that will get dissolved inside the water here in this chamber will be more than the one that has a moderate pressure. So according to the Henry's law, solubility of a particular gas for a given volume and a given temperature is directly proportional to the equilibrium partial pressure of the gas that is above that solvent. Alright, so that was one important concept that I wanted to discuss with you. And in order to help you with understanding the concept, think of the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, for instance. Patients, for some reason, that need higher oxygen tension, like for instance, if they had a central retinal artery occlusion, some physicians think that it may help for them to have higher oxygen concentration in their blood. So they would place these patients inside 100% oxygen chamber with a high pressure. So that's why it's called hyperbaric O2 chamber. As a consequence of which there would be increased amount of O2 that is dissolved in blood of those patients that are being placed inside the hyperbaric oxygen chamber. The next concept I would like to discuss with you is the surfactant. Which is basically a mix of phospholipids and proteins, and its function is to decrease surface tension of alveoli so that they wouldn't collapse on themselves. They would continue to maintain a balloon shape rather than collapsing on themselves. And so therefore, patients with the respiratory distress syndrome, where there is deficiency of surfactant, are at increased risk of alveolar collapse. The next concept is different mechanisms of protection against diseases by the respiratory tract. So as we just discussed, number one is with the help of nasal hairs to filter particles that are being inhaled through our nose. In addition, our respiratory secretions contain the antibody called IgA, in addition to antimicrobial protein called lysozyme that destroys bacterial cell wall. So bacterial cell wall is being targeted by lysozyme. And then finally, there is also secretion of lactoferrin, which inhibits bacterial metabolism. We already discussed that there are mucus and cilia along the respiratory tree in order to trap any particles that have been passing the filters of our nasal hairs. We discussed how those particles that reach the alveoli will get engulfed by macrophages. And then finally, there are mast cells which can recognize different allergens and respond by releasing histamine, which induces an inflammatory reaction. Like for instance, it will cause closure of the bronchioles so that we inhale less of that allergen. All right? So different mechanisms of protection against disease: filtering air by our nasal hairs, antimicrobial components that are being secreted by the respiratory tract, mucus and cilia, macrophages, as well as mast cells for initiating an inflammatory reaction. The final concept that we are discussing here is the breathing mechanism. And so in order to understand that, first I would like to discuss the structure of the lungs in a little more detail. So basically, the lung is covered with a connective tissue sac that is organized into two layers. One is called the parietal or outer layer that is fused with the wall of the thoracic cavity. And then we have the inner or visceral layer that is fused with the surface of the lungs. Now the space that is located between the parietal and visceral layer is called pleural cavity, which has a slightly lower pressure than the atmospheric pressure. Therefore, we can say that there is a small vacuum that is inside the pleural cavity. So now I can show you what happens with the structure of the lung. So just focus on the image that I've shown you right here. We have the atmospheric pressure that is at 760. Then we have the intrapleural pressure, which is basically the pressure between the visceral and the parietal layer. So here we have the visceral or inner layer and then parietal or outer layer. Okay, so this vacuum that we are having here, shown by -4 millimeter Hg, is holding the lungs and the chest wall together. Because if we release that gap, if we don't couple the lungs with the chest wall, what happens is that the chest wall will expand and the lungs will recoil on themselves and they won't be connected anymore. So that's the job of the intrapleural cavity, which is to connect the lungs with the chest wall. And this cavity has a negative pressure, like a vacuum, that holds them together. So now what happens during inspiration? During inspiration, the chest wall will continue to expand. And so consequently, the amount of vacuum that is in our intrapleural space will become more. So here the intrapleural pressure will further decrease. And this decrease in pressure will pull the lungs outward. So as the chest goes outward, so does the intrapleural pressure becomes more negative, and consequently the lungs will be pulled outward. So as the lungs are pulled outward, there would be a negative pressure buildup in the alveoli, and so therefore air will enter, because now the alveolar pressure is less than the atmospheric air. And so during the end respiration, the alveolar pressure is now equal to the atmospheric pressure. And so next we have to exhale the air. So as diaphragm relaxes, so during inspiration, diaphragm contracted and the chest wall expanded, as a consequence of which there was increased total volume of the lungs. Now during expiration, diaphragm relaxes and pushes the lungs upward, as a consequence of which the pleural pressure will now increase from -8 to -6, as a consequence of which the volume of the lung will decrease. Once the volume of the lung decreases, there is now positive pressure in the alveoli that will push the air out of the lungs into the outside space. All right, so here we have summarized the mechanism of inspiration and expiration. You can pause the video and go over all the pressure changes if you need to. But one last concept that I would like to discuss here with you is different muscles that are involved in forced inspiration or forced expiration. So basically during inspiration, we have contraction of diaphragm, which flattens and moves inferiorly, and we also have external intercostal muscles, which will help elevate the rib cage and move sternum anteriorly. So by contraction of the diaphragm and by contraction of the intercostal muscles, the chest wall expands and the diaphragm moves downward. Consequently, the lung volume increases, pressure in the alveoli becomes negative, and thus air will flow from atmosphere into the lungs. So air flow into the lungs. And so keep in mind that the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles were involved in inspiration. Now what happens during expiration? During expiration, these two muscles will relax, as a consequence of which the lungs' elasticity will now prompt the thoracic wall as well as the diaphragm to recoil backward. Okay? And that's what happens during passive expiration. So if you pay attention, for breathing, we have to take some efforts and breathe air in. But exhalation is much easier. Even if you don't take any actions, you can see that the air will be exhaled out easily. It's because the recoil property of the lungs allows the chest wall to recoil back on itself. But then what happens when we have to forcefully exhale air out? So for forceful exhalation, that's the time that some other muscles are being recruited, and these include, number one, contraction of the internal intercostal muscles. So recall how the external intercostal muscle was required for expanding the chest wall. Here the internal intercostal muscles will recoil the chest wall inward. We can also have abdominal muscles. So if you push the abdominal muscles hard, that's the time that the air will be exhaled faster out of our lungs. And then finally, there are other accessory muscles and abdominal organs that push superiorly against the diaphragm to forcefully push air out of the lungs. Alright, so once again, during inspiration, we are using diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. During quiet expiration, these two muscles will relax, as a consequence of which the recoil property, the lung elasticity, will let air out of the lungs. However, if we want to forcefully exhale air out of our lungs, then we can use internal intercostal muscles, abdominal muscles, as well as other accessory muscles that will push superiorly against the diaphragm. Alright, so that concludes our discussion of this video. Next, I would like to go over some practice questions, and then we would be done with this video. Alright, so which of the following is a true statement? So you can pause the video and go through one of the laws that is discussed here. The next question is, contraction of abdominal muscles causes. So we just discussed this. The question is, how does intrapleural and alveolar pressure changes in relation to the atmospheric pressure? And finally, expansion of lungs is accompanied by. Alright, so once again, if you need more time, please, by all means, you can go ahead and pause the video. So here it's discussing the Laplace and Henry's law. We've already discussed Henry's law, but I would like to provide some background information on Laplace law. So basically what Laplace law says is that once we are dealing with a container that has internal fluid pressure, the larger that the radius of that container gets, the more wall tension is required to withstand that internal fluid pressure. So here, let's say that we have a container that has a small radius and we have another container that has a large radius. So here there is a lot of pressure on this larger radius wall versus on this smaller radius one there is smaller pressure. So for this wall, in order to hold and contain the internal fluid pressure, a larger wall tension is needed. So large wall tension versus smaller wall tension is needed on the left side. So same thing happened with an example of an aneurysm. Once we have a blood supply and an aneurysm develops, now this aneurysm, as it gets larger, it's easier for it to expand, as a consequence of which it will break off, because the strength of the wall doesn't increase, but now there is more pressure on the aneurysm. Same thing applies with our alveoli. Once we have a respiratory tract that joins with a small alveola and another large alveola, if there is air that is going in, it's much easier to expand the one with a larger radius. And I can give you a live example. For instance, when you're trying to inflate a balloon, at the beginning it's very hard, but once you start to put some air inside that balloon, it's much easier now to blow air inside it. And so same example can be applied to alveoli. Once the radius of one alveoli increases, it's easier to expand it, versus this one has higher collapsing pressure. This alveoli is at increased risk of collapsing and undergoing atelectasis. So now with that information in mind, we can go ahead and try to answer this question. According to Laplace law, alveolar collapse can be prevented by reduced production of surfactant. Well, surfactant is kind of like a phospholipid and protein that will keep pushing the walls outside. And so it reduces chance of atelectasis, or in other words, it reduces chance of the collapse of alveoli by decreasing surface tension. And that is talking about surfactant. So here it's saying alveolar collapse can be prevented by reduced production of surfactant. It should be by increased production of surfactant, and that wouldn't still relate to Laplace law. Laplace law is relating to the radius of the container we are talking here. Choice B, so choice A is out of the question. Choice B, according to Laplace law, alveolar collapse is less likely at end respiration. So what happens at end respiration? At end respiration, our lungs have expanded, as a consequence of which the volume of all the alveoli has expanded. And so yes, that's correct. Alveolar collapse is less likely at end respiration because now alveoli have a larger radius. Choice C. According to Henry's law, alveolar collapse can be prevented by increasing partial pressure of oxygen. Well, Henry's law we just discussed explained that by increasing partial pressure of oxygen, more oxygen will get dissolved inside blood. But then Henry's law doesn't relate to the concept of alveolar collapse. So choice C is out of question. And then finally, choice D. This is basically a description of Dalton's law. So per Dalton's law, the total pressure exerted by atmospheric air is equal to the sum of partial pressure of the individual gases. All right. So therefore choice D would also be incorrect because it's not a true statement. All right, moving on to the next question. Contraction of abdominal muscle causes. So what happens when we are contracting our abdominal muscles? We are pushing the diaphragm and everything upward, as a consequence of which the intrapleural pressure will become more positive. Okay, so here we are having the lungs and we are pushing it upward. So the lungs are now getting smaller, and so intrapleural pressure increases, and so does the alveolar pressure, as a consequence of which now air would be exhaled. So there would be more positive intrapleural pressure, that's correct, resulting in having an alveoli pressure that is more than atmospheric pressure. So choice B is correct, and that would lead to exhalation. And if we were talking about inhalation, which of these choices would have been correct? Well, during inhalation, we will have more negative intrapleural pressure, as a consequence of which the atmospheric pressure will be higher than alveolar pressure. And so if we were talking about inhalation, choice C would have been correct. More negative intrapleural pressure, as a consequence of which air will flow from atmosphere into the alveoli. Moving on to the last question. Expansion of lungs is accomplished by, well, transport of oxygen or carbon dioxide have nothing to do with expansion of lungs. So choice A and choice B are incorrect. Relaxation of diaphragm, we just discussed how after the diaphragm relaxes, the lungs will recoil on itself and get smaller. So that would also be incorrect. And so therefore choice D would be the correct answer, but here I would like to discuss what I mean by negative pressure pumping. So what happens when there is expansion of the chest wall? So here we have the lungs that are connected with the intrapleural space to the chest wall. And then we have diaphragm at the bottom. So once the diaphragm contracts and the rib cage or the chest wall expands, there would be a negative pressure that builds up surrounding the lungs, as a consequence of which the lung, due to its negative pressure, in other words the vacuum that is surrounding the lung, it will cause expansion of the lung. And so once lung expands, its alveolar pressure drops and air will be inhaled. So that's the mechanism that we just described right here. But my point is that the mechanism of pumping air is by inducing a negative pressure in the tissues that are surrounding the lungs. And so therefore choice D would be the correct answer. And so that covers our discussion of the respiratory tract system. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you for the next lecture.